Hey guys, it's Bree. Um, I watched Elizabeth over at Books and Pieces and her video about science fiction and its canon. And I've been thinking about it a lot. I watched it a couple of hours ago and I'm just like, my brain is going with it. And I thought that I would maybe chime in and do a video as a response. So I should clarify this, or I should preface this rather, with the statement that I am by no means somebody who has all the answers. I don't think that my ideas are the only ideas or the only legitimate ones. And to me, what is more important, and I say this about basically every topic that I think is important, is that I put an idea out there and you respond, right? We can't get closer to any kind of conclusion without the actual deliberative process, and in a way the deliberation is more important than the conclusion. So that being said, let's talk about science fiction and its canon. This is an interesting topic because I think you get a lot of conflicting ideas about whether science fiction does or does not have a canon. The reason a canon is potentially important is because it provides us with a narrative. It provides us with a sense of direction and where we go. History is something that allows us to contextualize a lot of different new movements, right? And it allows us to have a clear and kind of defined conversation about what we're seeing that's new and likable and good. In a similar way, it allows us to kind of talk about where we're going and where we want to go, where we came from, and what's influential. And this is the idea of canon as narrative and as a part of identity is something that I'll probably talk about a little later. I have all of the thoughts. But first I want to push back on the idea that science fiction doesn't have a canon. Just because we don't say, here's the canon, does not mean we don't have a canon, right? It doesn't mean that there isn't the pressure that if you really want to understand science fiction, that you don't go and read Heinlein, or you don't go and read H.G. Wells, right? Like these big kind of markers in science fiction and where it came from. Those are things that exist regardless of whether we're putting it down in a list. And in fact, I would argue that by not having a clear and defined canon, we actually in a lot of ways make life more difficult for ourselves. The canon acts as a way of legitimizing a development in science fiction. And without saying clearly, here is the canon, here's where we began, and here's where we started, it makes it a lot harder to legitimize something and its influence and how it changes our direction. So if I don't say, you know, here's the history of science fiction up until the 1960s, and then we have Le Guin and Joanna Russ and James Tiptree Jr., and here's how they influence science fiction, and here's how we're going in a different direction now that those authors have come out and become influential and really made their mark on science fiction, it becomes a lot more difficult for me to make the case that science fiction has ever been anything different, or that science fiction has changed in a direction. It makes it harder for me to, not just me, I'm talking about, you know, like the general me, but it makes it harder for us to have a conversation about change and what change is good, and it makes it harder for us to legitimize a history, right? It makes it harder to say, here's the history of women's science fiction and how it actually was integrated into science fiction as a whole. The idea of a canon is really extremely problematic, right? Because what it does is it says that here is the history. Here is the narrative that we're going to tell. And it seems like a very static thing, especially, I think, because our model for a literary canon is literary fiction and the classics, right? And the story that we tell there tends not to change. You know, who do we keep on the literary fiction canon? You keep Melville, and you keep Daniel Defoe, and you keep Alexander Dumas, and it doesn't change. And so the story that we have and the model of a literary canon is a very static model, and I think that that's very intimidating. But just because that particular model of a literary canon has not changed and is resistant to change doesn't mean that we can't take a different approach to how we want to adapt our own story, right? If we are having an active conversation about our canon, right, an active and open conversation, we can say, hey, we're missing an entire history here. We're not incorporating, you know, this Chinese history or, you know, African science fiction into this overarching tale that we're telling about science fiction. That's a problem, right? If we don't have that actively defined, we can't identify those weaknesses. And we then can't legitimize the incorporation of them into our history overall. The other thing that comes to mind for me when we talk about a canon is that we have these Hugo Awards every year and the Nebulas every year. And their purpose is to say what's pushing the limits of science fiction, what's doing something new or special, or what is the best of science fiction or fantasy. And we can't have those without having some kind of context, right? We can't say what's pushing the limits if there are no limits defined. And in a way, by saying what's pushing the limits, we define and expand our canon, right? We say these are fantastic books. These are what you should be reading if you want to see the development of this story, or if you want to see what's going to mark a change in this genre. And in a similar way, because we're not having a clear conversation about what is the canon, what is the identity and the history of this genre, but we're still going ahead and saying this pushes the limits of the genre, I think you open yourself up to a lot of controversy because people are working from different base points, right? Like, we're not all thinking of the same books when we think of what is the best. And while that will probably never be the case, right? People are always going to debate this should have been canon or this should not be canon. By having a kind of a clear starting point, I think you cut off a lot of the tension around what new books are actually, you know, doing what we want them to do. If I don't make it clear that I'm incorporating, you know, these particular female authors and the route that they took and the message fiction that they wrote into my canon, it becomes a lot easier for people to get upset when I'm awarding books that kind of stem from that lineage. And again, it's so difficult to talk about a canon because it's problematic, and the model that we have for it is something that's so stationary, that hasn't changed really ever. And that's an intimidating model to come from, but I don't think that that's the only way that you have to pursue a literary canon. And I think especially in science fiction, something that's so changeable and has incorporated so many different histories, and really is supposed to pride itself on pushing limits, right? On being an inclusive kind of area to write in. I think we can take a different route. I think that we can be more inclusive in our canon, especially because the conversation and the time that we're having this talk in now, especially focusing in on the genre of science fiction, it's not just the same kind of person who's making this decision. we have a much broader community and a much more, I think, open and inclusive sense of what the genre is and should be. That to have a conversation about what is our canon is actually, it's more productive to have it now than it would be if it were existing. I don't know. And like I said, just because we don't say here's the canon doesn't mean that one doesn't already exist. Maybe taking the time to actually clarify what we as a community believe to be the canon is a positive step towards getting everybody kind of on the same page and allowing people to make the kind of objections that we can accommodate and listen to, and allow us to legitimize other paths in science fiction. I tend to be a very optimistic person. I've long believed that we as a community can be welcoming and loving and incorporate one another's histories in a respectful way. And so maybe I just have an overly positive approach to what is science fiction's canon and the kind of steps that we can be taking with the canon that would be improvements on the models that we've seen going forward. But I don't think it's a bad thing inherently to have a canon. I don't think that it's a bad thing to be able to have that conversation about what is our history and what are we not incorporating, what are we incorporating, what are we giving too much weight to, right? And a canon allows you to actually have that discussion. But I don't know, these are just my thoughts and me babbling, and I want to know if you disagree with me. I want to know. And I want to hear your thoughts on what is the science fiction canon, and does it exist, and should it exist? I don't know. What are the benefits of it? What are the drawbacks to having a canon? I think this is a really important discussion to be having, especially considering the kind of conflict we've been seeing in the last 5 or so years. And also I just think it's interesting because it really is a matter of history and identity and the stories that we tell ourselves about where we as a community have come from and are going. But anyways, let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you made a video about this, link it to me so that I can watch it. But yeah, let me know your thoughts. I hope you're having a great reading week. I'll talk to you later. Bye.